The global war on farmers intensified amid food shortages. Believe it or not, this is not Africa. This is California this summer, the drought in California. And the poor cattle are trying to, well, one of them is in the water reservoir, are trying to get to the water. This is unbelievable. And more unbelievable is this thing here. This is July 5th, 2022 in Holland. This is a Holland supermarket. You can see the produce is not even there. So is this what we're going to be facing? God forbid. A stork flies over a wheat field as a combine harvester from agricultural company TVK seed harvest wheat not far from Ukraine in July 29, 2022. The effects of what critics have described as a global war on farmers and ranchers are becoming increasingly apparent. But even as food shortages intensify, governments, including the Biden administration, are putting harder pressures on agricultural production. Experts and lawmakers who spoke to Epoch Times, this is an article from them, warned that the time has come to curb government policies that hit the poor the hardest. A Republican lawmaker said a GOP-led Congress would immediately begin taking the necessary actions once it takes control. And as we know, in 3 days we have elections in the United States, midterm elections. Now, while the attacks on agriculture and related industries look different in each country, many experts say it is a coordinated global policy promoted by the United Nations, the World Economic Forum of Klaus Schwab and Harari, the European Union, and other international forces determined to transform civilization. In July, Epoch Times published an in-depth investigative article that cited several professionals in the field who said that UN-backed policies on climate change and sustainable development, which they described as quote-unquote war on farmers, were to blame immediately on the escalating food crisis. The effect of policies targeting agricultural producers is beginning to become clear, with food shortages becoming increasingly acute globally. Think Sri Lanka, but on a global scale, at least if current trend continues. UN leaders and Western officials are discussing it openly. President Joe Biden, for example, cited the conflict in Ukraine, warned earlier this year that the real food shortages would soon follow. Meanwhile, UN World Food Program Director David Beasley has been warning since the start of COVID crisis of catastrophic global food shortages that could lead to famine of biblical proportions in dozens of nations. The world must open its eyes to this unprecedented global food crisis and act immediately to stop it spiraling out of control, he said just last month at World Food Day, event organized by UN agency of which is led by a member of the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. In fact, with farmers and ranchers under increasing regulatory pressure, many authoritative sources warn that even rich countries like the United States could begin to see problems in the food supply chain and other critical areas in the coming months. A farmer applies fertilizer ground before planting near Dwight, Illinois. These are various images. Europe is suffering as well. In Europe, the cracks in the system are beginning to show. Already more and more items are missing from the supermarket shelves as prices soar. In the UK and Germany, escalating store shortages have been making headlines for weeks. Many nations around the world, particularly in the Middle East and Africa, are already facing major food crises. And with UN-backed sustainable policies by government and the financial industry decimating energy systems and agricultural production, the problem is likely to grow, experts say. It's especially hard on the poor. And Dr. E. Calvin Basner, president of Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation, blasting anti-farming policies that are supposed to combat climate change. Banning or reducing the use of nitrate fertilizers in the name of fighting global warming is sheer nonsense, he said. And he pointed to policies being pursued by governments around the world in response to the UN campaign. Beisner said, nitrogen oxides are a small factor in the overall greenhouse effect, overshadowed hundreds of times by carbon dioxide and thousands of times by water vapor. The infrared wavelengths at which nitrogen oxides absorb have already been absorbed and almost completely. Therefore, they can contribute only an insignificant amount to global warming. But their contribution to human well-being is enormous, multiplying crop yields per acre, per labor hour, and per capital input, making food more abundant and less expensive for all, Basner said, and leading authority on environmental issues. The ones who benefit the most from this are the poor. A war against farmers is a war against the poor, he said. War on peasants. The war on farmers has been clearly seen in the Netherlands, Sri Lanka, South Africa, Canada, and many other nations, even in the United States. Publicly, pretexts of these policies include saving the planet from supposedly anthropogenic climate change, addressing various other environmental issues, improving economic efficiency, and even giving land to indigenous populations. But critics say the real motive appears to be much darker. The ultimate goal of powerful international actors, according to international organizations such as the WEF, which are behind many of the policies that lead to food insecurity, is to restructure every element of life on the planet, every element of life. From rethinking individual property rights to drawing up a new social contract, everything needs to be transformed. WEF founder Klaus Schwab and his organization have argued for years, promoting what they call the Great Reset. But not everyone is on their side. The Cattlemen Pasture Legal Action Fund, United Cattlemen of America, known as RCALF USA for short, represents cattlemen and ranchers across the country. The group is sounding the alarm about the dangers of the UN and WEF agenda, of course. What's happening is that the globalists have an agenda that can be achieved more effectively by targeting the low-hanging fruit, said RCAF USA CEO Bill Bullard in an interview with Epoch Times, saying the trend was evident when the Dutch government declared war on the farmers of that country. What they're doing is targeting the part of the agricultural industry that is least able to absorb these additional regulatory costs, he said. When governments impose these policies, the ones who can bear these additional costs are the big agribusinesses, not the small ones. This is an effort to eliminate independent farmers and ranchers around the world, Bullard said, noting that governments and international organizations are cooperating in this effort. Herdsmen, farmers, and ranchers are the front line. They are targeted because they are easy to remove. Pointing to the numerous policies of the Biden administration that target farmers, Bullard said that if it doesn't stop, we're going to see farmers and ranchers drop like flies. The ultimate goal, Bullard says, is the further consolidation and concentration of food production by the supranational global elitists, international courts, the World Economic Forum, and all the rest. All of this comes from the UN Sustainable Development Agenda, Agenda 230 and Agenda 21, and the multinational corporations that are all involved in influencing and cooperating with the UN, he said. RCALF USA President Brett Kensey also chimed in, saying the global elites are promoting sustainability, which he described as the latest false idolatry that should terrify us all. Kensey said, all they want is everything, and your ability to make a living on your private property will be their first prey. The UN supported policies. Indeed, as the Epoch Times reported in a recent article titled UN World Economic Forum Behind Global War on Farmers, some of the UN 230 Agenda's Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, are directly linked to global war against farmers. The goals, which were developed with the help of the CCP of China and have been adopted by governments around the world, call for drastic changes in agriculture, production, and even consumption. They have been regularly mentioned by governments during the development of the idea of the policies that many experts blame for the food crisis. The WEF, meanwhile, has signed a formal strategic partnership, quote unquote, with the United Nations, aimed at bringing big business around the world into the movement to enforce Agenda 230 goals on the planet. The text of the agreement promises to deepen institutional commitment and jointly accelerate the implementation of 230 Agenda for Sustainable Development. UN-backed government policies targeting the energy sector also play a role in the growing of food shortage, experts say. For example, Europe's effort to phase out reliable energy sources, including hydrocarbon power and nuclear power, have had devastating consequences for European industry because of the energy shortage. Fertilizer production, a critical agricultural supply, has been particularly hard hit. Due to soaring fertilizer prices, food production has been put at risk as food prices rise globally. In the United States, the Biden administration, the bureaucracy, and Congress have also targeted agriculture and energy. The Inflation Reduction Act, for example, would see taxpayers pay farmers not to farm under the guise of implementing climate-friendly crop rotation. The Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, has also angered farmers across the country with a proposed regulation that would force them to monitor emissions if they work with a publicly traded company. It's not just the government. Major banks and investment managers around the world have also signed up to UN policies that contribute to the food crisis. In fact, a coalition of 19 attorney generals from mostly Republican states is investigating possible collusion between America's 6 largest banks and the UN's Net Zero Banking Alliance. As participants in the UN program, the banks agreed to pursue net zero emissions by 2050, ending or radically reducing investment and lending to traditional energy producers and agricultural interests. Multiple state attorneys involved in the investigation told Epoch Times that this collusion by U.S. banks with the UN undermines U.S. agriculture and industry while benefiting the Chinese Communist regime. Our own money is being used as a weapon against us, West Virginia Treasury Riley Moore said, as he railed against big banks for targeting key industries. This is by Epoch Times Greece. I've translated for you from a Greek article. Please leave your comments. Thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.